Hello and welcome to the Breaking Ground show here on iPropertyRadio, the show that brings you all the voices shaping the future of Ireland's built environment. I'm your host, Katie Tallon, and today we're joined by returning guest Paul Sheridan, Director of Main Contracting at the Construction Industry Federation, or CIF. And more importantly, Paul has been a contributor to an important policy paper called Building Ireland's Future, Unlocking the Construction Workforce Through Project Certainty and Reform. Paul, welcome back to the show and thank you for welcoming us into Construction House today.
You're very welcome and good afternoon, Carol. It's
Well,
good to be back on the show.
Do you know, we're delighted to be able to do this in person, to be within Construction House, because I wanted to talk to you about the policy paper I mentioned there. So let's jump right in. The policy paper makes quite a bold assertion, contradicting some of the narrative that's gone out, and it says that essentially the construction workforce isn't the problem when it comes to project delays. So can you explain what you mean by that? And if labour shortages aren't the problem, then what is?
Sure, I suppose a key message here is to make it very clear that the CF and the industry is very confident that it has the capacity to meet the demands under the NDP, delivery of critical infrastructure, meeting housing for all, and supporting our FDI sector. It's there. What we want to try and do is identify in the paper some of the models that have presented some of the forecasts and the possible inaccuracies in how the models are formed. But we also wanted to explain how the industry works, to explain that it has capacity, and it's because it's a very transitory industry. And what I mean by that is that projects at different stages, you require skill sets, different types of skill sets. And what happens is that when that skill set is no longer required, it moves to the next project. So you get these massive efficiencies. It's almost nomadic. So people move and flow, and they transition from different types of projects. So you could have certain crews working on apartment blocks that have moved from office buildings. You've got crews that are doing bridges and they'll shift across to doing rail and road. So it shifts, and that gives you, I suppose, flexibility and efficiency. I think it's really important to understand that right now, many of our contractors and our members are telling us that the Irish construction industry cannot sustain their businesses here because they've so much spare capacity. They have to shift it either to the UK, to the US, and they're working with multinationals and foreign governments instead of actually working here. So why is that? Well, we believe that the real constraints are on the planning and consent side of things, which create bottlenecks, and then the lack of pipeline and multi-annual funding for projects. What does that do? It creates uncertainty. And it means that the contractors and builders are looking and going, well, where's the next bit of work coming from? I have to go where I can be sure I have certainty of business so I can plan. And I think the important thing then is to start looking at some of the stats here, Carol.
Yeah.
Like we are seeing figures being thrown around that the industry needs an extra 100,000 people in the next 2 years. Well, let's logically think about that, right? The industry has 176,000 people in it. It's growing about 3 to 4% a year. Okay, that's where we're at. Now, 100,000 extra people is a 56% increase in 2 years. What industry does that, right? So let's look at the reality. The reality is that some of the models, for example, made a prediction of an extra 216,000 workers required in the construction industry by 2020. We're still at 176,000 and the industry continues to grow. We have scaled up in terms of, I suppose, the number of housing that's been delivered, the units, and my colleague Conor O'Connell will be much more of an expert on that side of things, right? But let's just take some of the figures in terms of the last decade, okay? Just to show how the industry has responded. And as well, there was a presentation by the ESB yesterday at a conference, and they showed how they've ramped up expenditure, nearly doubling their output, and the industry has grown with them. So there's another specific example. But from 2011 to 2021, residential production increased by 94%. From 2012 to 2023, housing completions increased by 570%. So about 5,000 houses up to 32,700 odd units, right? Civil engineering production increased by 56% and non-residential by 98%. So gross domestic physical capital formation increased by 145%.
And do we know the tally of how the workforce increased in line with that?
Yes. Well, I suppose, give an example, the workforce did not increase at the same rate. From 2020 to 2024, it increased by approximately 18%. And that was despite COVID. So it shows that we're able to scale up. And we're not saying that we don't need to attract new talent into the industry and don't need to upskill. We're not saying that. We're saying every industry has those problems. What we're saying is that it can deliver, provided the pipeline, the certainty is there, because what that means, you'll invest in your people. You will use the new professional apprenticeships, the craft apprenticeships. You know, we will run our careers campaigns to attract new talent in the industry. We will provide the training courses. We work in Mount Lucas to reskill our people. And members will then look and go, well, we have a pipeline, and we know it's coming down. Well, we're going to shift our equipment and our plant and our people that are working in other jurisdictions and come into it.
There's a lot of what you've said there, so I want to try and unpack it piece by piece, because some of it is not very intuitive, as in people I don't think, or people might be surprised by it. So before we look at the models that actually is trying to forecast what the labour demand will be, let's look at, I think you put it as maybe a lack of understanding about how construction works. So let's go back to basics. You know, you point out the need for multi-annual visibility for or project certainty, essentially, and the lack thereof is a major issue for Ireland's construction industry. So how could that change, and what would it mean for the industry if they had that multi-annual visibility on a pipeline of projects?
Well, it means they, as I said, they line up their people, their resources and their business planning towards those projects coming downstream, and they've confidence. So, for example, Ishka Erin had worked with the industry and had worked with them to ramp up and scale them up and escalate. Suddenly, their funding dropped off a cliff. They'd no money. They had to tell the contractors they'd no money. So the contractors had ramped up. Suddenly, there's no work coming. What do? They have to use their labour or lay it off. So they move it to other jurisdictions. Now, the problem is, once they move, it's not like you just switch a switch and we've got the money, lads, come back. They go, well, sorry, we have commitments, contracts and resources allocated for the next 2 years into this. So suddenly you've lost that capacity because they've had to go and chase it, and they're usually doing it. Like, the number of my members are growing massively in the United States. Some of them are working a lot in the UK now on the water side of it. But that's just the water. You can take it from...
Can we get specific though about examples? Because you actually had examples of 4 of your members within that policy document. And I was stunned at the scale of the decrease in spending. So you might just explain how that, and I know we're only looking at a sample of 4 members, but between those 4 members, they were between what, 5 and 30 million of a, or
of
35 million of a decrease.
Drop. Yeah.
So a revenue drop of between 5 and 30 million.
It's
explain
huge.
what that looks like on the ground.
What it looks like on the ground, it means you could be delivering a project. Suddenly there's no more money. You've got plant, so that's cranes. It could be major excavating equipment, pipe laying equipment. You've got people with specialist skills, welding skills, all that kind of thing. They're standing there. They still have to be paid. So you need to take them off that site and find more work for them. So they disappear, and that's why they shifted to different jurisdictions.
Is that the reality? Are many of the CIF members now looking outside of Ireland where they might not have previously?
Look, I'm getting phone calls from members, big contractors, walking the streets of London looking for work, and they can't get it here.
That's very reminiscent of 2011, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's the reality. And a lot of this is contractors, subcontractors as well, mechanical and electrical contractors that my colleague Denise Tuffy would represent. They're also working with us. Even the data centres, for example, the pharma, they're all moving now with those clients to other jurisdictions to maintain their businesses. They can't sustain them here. So when we hear stories about, the industry hasn't got the capacity to deliver, it's for us to think. And I think even the government's own statistics will show that there was one particular one by the Department of Finance that made a prediction that we would need, I think it was an extra, this is to do with housing, for extra 13,000 housing units we needed 17,500 extra people by 2025. We hit the 33,000 units in 2023 with just an additional extra 6,500 people, thereabouts.
So how are the models so out?
That's because they're not recognising how the industry works, and that goes back to that. If you're assuming that, right, okay, it takes 5 people to build one house, well, to build 50 you need 10 times, 50 times 5, whatever the numbers are. So what we're saying is that, no, look at the industry in terms of how it actually operates. Projects come on stream, labour flows. It flows for a period of time on that project, and then another project is opened up here, and they take the labour off that site and they move to there, and they bring in the next labour to deal with the next phase of project. So you get this. It's almost like it's like the monetary system. You put a fiver to somebody takes that fiver, they buy something. Well, you got to look at the industry as a very mobile, fluid sector, and it chases work and it moves. And the other thing I suppose we sometimes try to get across the government is that 67% of our members are doing none to low levels of public works contract. Why? Because it's just unattractive. So it's the lack of reform on public procurement makes it, and the flexibility with EU procurement, it makes it quite bureaucratic, expensive and costly to tender and risky. So there's a number of factors then pushing our members in different directions, and we believe the models should, instead of looking at them as like it's fixed, like a manufacturing plant, they recognise the mobility of the industry and how fluid and transient it can be. Those figures I said at the start of the interview, that showed how the industry was able to scale up and find the labour if it knows the work is coming. And I think it's really important. And the other thing I'd like to talk about as well is what we're not factoring a lot of here is, and I don't know whether they're factoring it in their reports, is the productivity. When you look at the productivity figures that are used, the general one from Europe and so forth, it generally looks at Ireland and includes all phases, right? It doesn't just look at the construction, it takes everything into planning and all that stuff, right? So what we're asking the government to do, take a look at the construction, splice it out, look at the manufacturing sector, that's part of the construction. What would we say? They produce materials, equipment, off-site manufacturing, modern medicine. Take those figures and join them together, and then you'll see the productivity figures. And how do we know that we're increasing our productivity? Well, the government, another report by a government, I think it was the Irish Government Economic Evaluation Service, they have shown that the number of workers on a construction site has dropped from 12 to 7.8 over a number of years. What does that say? It means we're getting far more efficient on site. That's what it says, and it's a government figure. So when they're doing the models and the predictions, are they factoring in the increasing levels of productivity? If you go to modern construction sites, they're the nearest thing you're going to get to a military operation. There's not hundreds of people running around the site anymore. It's very, very organised. It's almost like Lego. And that again is the use of, off-site manufacturing, modern 3D, 2D solutions and so forth, precast, curtain walling, etc., etc. And the CIF represents SOSA, the Smart Offsite Association, which my colleague Denise operates. So they're in that space, but many main contractors are using these techniques for many years, and it's a case of just encouraging clients to decide early in their contract, at tenders, before tender stage when they're doing design, that they want this, and the contractors will respond and deliver it. So it can be done. So you've got productivity issues and then understanding how the industry operates.
Well, there's another element as well, one that's been in the media for the last number of months finally, and that is around infrastructure. I think there was a very striking point in the policy paper there around, we touched on the revenue drop for some of the CIF members. Let's talk about that and the impact it's having on consumers, but bringing it back to maybe some of the stalled wastewater treatment projects. I was not aware of the scale of stalled projects. So you might just take us through those. And I think the report estimated that to be delaying the delivery of 10,000 homes, which is crazy. Can you just, particularly in a housing shortage, a housing crisis, so can you take us through those stalled projects and what can be done there?
Yeah, well, look, I suppose the paper lists off a number of projects like Newmarket on Fergus, Avoca wastewater treatment plants, and these are designed to increase capacity, whether it's for waste or whether it's for water, and they're designed in population equivalence, for example, and the production of litres of water per day. Okay, and that's designed to meet housing demand. So how much on average a year a house needs, in and out, so to speak. And they're able to make a prediction then, well, if we don't build that and expand that capacity, that we can't connect those 6,000 houses, we can't connect those 10,000 houses. And that's just the reality. So if you can have zone land, but if there's no services, you can't build houses. And it's not just water, it's connectivity to the transport network, it's the grid, it's electricity as well, it's broadband. These are the modern requirements. So when people say, it's building a house is just a case of throwing it down on a site, it's not. You have to prep the site first. Where are the schools? Where are the services? Where are the creches? They all have to be integrated into the development. So water and energy and housing and FDI and infrastructure, they're all the one ecosystem.
Yeah.
And there seems to be a real focus that it's all housing, but they have to step back a bit and look at the big picture, the strategic overview of what has to be delivered. There are many elements to it, and I suppose the best way to approach it is take a lean approach. lean construction approach and say, okay, well, what are the value streams here in terms of how we deliver homes and what's important? And the infrastructure is the critical factor here, the financing of it, whether it's private or whether it's public. If you don't finance the pipeline, the contractors won't invest and plan for it. So that's what we're trying to get across. And if you get those things lined up right, you get the contractors, and the capacity is there.
Paul, since you and I spoke about this previously, and I think you're always very straight when you talk about it, you say if there's no pipes in the ground, you can't build the houses on top. Fair enough. I think that's very simple for people to understand, and I think there's a growing understanding of that across not just consumers and the general public, but more importantly around our locally elected representatives, so they understand now actually it's okay to start talking about infrastructure. But since you and I spoke last, we now have a minister with responsibility for infrastructure. Are you optimistic is possibly the wrong word, but have you any reasons to believe that that's going to speed up the delivery of the infrastructure we need to be able to underpin the homes that we need?
Well, there's two important new bodies, we call them, that have been set up. One is the Infrastructure Division, which is almost set up as far as I know, and then you've got the Housing Activation Unit. The important thing is how they work together. How are they going to be, integrate what they're doing together? The other thing is that we have to move beyond identifying the barriers. We know what they are. What are solutions? What we're hearing from government and what the soundings are all sound quite positive. We need that turned into action. The review of the NDP ends, I think, at the end of June. They announced it in July. There's prioritisation. There has to be significant prioritisation of again, any project that support housing and FDI. That's critical because they're now interlinked. The housing is now making us uncompetitive, and it's making Ireland attractive to foreign direct investment. And the third pin, the key pin in that is the infrastructure. So we got to get those right. But I would say, look, for the infrastructural division, they are bringing in, real talent to try and facilitate. It's just how much power the minister is going to give to that division to go and make decisions and break down the necessary walls to get things. And I would say you've got to look at the situation we have, right? This is public infrastructure for the public good. The level of processes that state agencies have to go through to get this delivered is unbelievable. And it just keeps getting worse, more layers and more layers.
But Minister Jack Chambers has addressed that, he has called that out, and in fact he specifically said that he acknowledges that narrow interests are derailing the public good. He knows that.
But
so
what the thing is, what are you going to do about it? Now, there are legislation in place, around exemptions for certain types of infrastructure development. Could they be expanded so that you've got pumping stations and don't have to seek plan permission? How do you look at pipes in the ground or electricity grids or substations? Why? They're necessary for the public good. Why do they need to go for planning? They should just deliver it in accordance with the law and audited at the end to make sure that they're compliant. I mean, that's how contracts work. So even consents, you've state agencies going to other state agencies to get consents to build stuff for the state that the state is paying for. So why is not that happening in a room?
It's like
upstream?
the right hand isn't speaking to the left.
So like for example, if the EPA have to provide a consent, why doesn't the EPA tell, this is what we want you to do at the start, so design that into your project please, and we'll check it at the end.
Well, let's get specific about reforms, because the paper does call for reforms to public procurement, and I know you and I have spoken about this at length before, so if anybody wants to hear a more in-depth discussion about that, we will link to your previous interview here talking specifically about public sector or public procurement reform. But can you just explain now what that would look like? What is good procurement for where we are now?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is that procurement of construction and built assets of any type is not buying laptops. It's a long duration. It takes over time. It can transcend governments. You're managing logistics, and you're managing risk, and you're managing uncertainty over a long period of time. And there's many elements to a construction project. So that needs to be recognised. And I think it's a welcome move that the Construction Policy Unit that existed within the OGP has now been moved into this new infrastructure division, because they'll bring huge amount of expertise and knowledge in how to actually procure good procurement. The challenge with the procurement system is threefold. It's the pipeline, as I keep going back, it's the investment. That's really important. Mm-hmm. But when you get into the procurement process, it starts with the design. Getting the design right, getting the quality of the design, getting the contractor in early to help with that process. Risk profiling. What is the risk of something going wrong here in this project? How do we mitigate it? Have we mitigated it? Now can we transfer it, or do we have to own it? You can't simply say, well, you know what, we'll just give the contractor risk for utilities. Mm-hmm. When the contractor has no control over risk area, any more control than, say, a government department would. So you have to think about these things. Who's best able to control that? Because if you hand something over like that, well, then it's a premium on it. If you're actually paying it. So getting the procurement right and getting the risk profiling right. And then when you do award the contract, what you want to do is put it on quality. So you want to measure carbon in the tender, so that you get most sustainable projects are being picked to deliver. Once you get into contract, then you have the rules of the game. And at the moment, the public works contract is simply imbalanced. There's too much risk passed over to the contractor. And what's happening is that we have a perception that, and it's a real perception, that most public works contracts are awarded the lowest price. So you get these big competitions with a bad contract, and it just causes challenges on site. So we always say, what are the forces? Quality and award, greater collaboration, which is getting earlier contract involvement, understanding the risk, avoiding disputes, incentivizing performance, pain gain, and thing. You want to look at the risk profiling and the liability in terms of, can that contractor actually control the risk? If he can, let him price it, let him measure it. But ultimately, and this is the critical thing now, is we've got to get design right. And what we're saying is that the government must recognise that design is really important work. You have to spend the time and the money with your design consultants, your design teams, to get as much information down on paper as accurate as possible to get the best outcome. What we're seeing is this political rush to get projects delivered, and they're being pushed out to tender, and it's all been shifted, the design has been shifted, sometimes clandestinely, to the contractor. And what that is, just leads to major problems downstream. So getting the design right, spending the time on it, and getting your contractors in early is the key to successful projects.
Is there a role, the new EU committee, special committee to tackle the housing crisis across Europe, has a special remit to look at not just affordable housing, but also construction innovation and procurement reform? Is there a role for the EU here, do you see, between the departments, the Irish departments here that have responsibility touching off public procurement and the reform that needs to happen, or do we need some direction from Europe here?
We do need support from Europe, particularly around EU procurement rules. They're very difficult to work through. There are mechanisms like competitive dialogue and so forth, but you really have to have highly skilled people on the public side of it to manage their way through it, because they could get into trouble with the law. It's very difficult. So you need a simplification of the procurement. You need more dialogue at the start, more flexibility to engage with the industry. You need the ability to be able to identify risk and deal with it post-tender. You have to have the flexibility. The EU won't allow any of that, whereas the private sector you can. So you're able to manage an awful lot of the risk out of the project up front. Mm-hmm. And that's why it's quicker, it's speedier. Contractors are more attracted to it, clients get the products more effectively. So yeah.
We're just over the critical first 100 days of government. We've talked about some of the initiatives that Minister Jack Chambers has put forward. As you and I are sitting in Construction House today recording this, the meeting of the Special Infrastructure Task Force, they're meeting for the first time. We don't know what the outcome of that is going to be, but we know that there are strong, fresh voices in the conversation. Do you have reasons to believe, I mean, not just to be hopeful, but I suppose we want a more industry-informed approach to policy making. So on behalf of your members, what's the most important message? We've covered a lot today. That policy document is definitely critical reading for policymakers, and in fact I'd encourage all of the industry to download it from the CIF website and take a look, because there's some really interesting stats in that. But I suppose before we wrap, what's your one key message for government stakeholders listening today?
Industry has the capacity. What we need to see is multi-annual funding, reform of procurement, and we need to see the key barriers and bottlenecks in the planning consent system dealt with. They're the three things. And the funding is critical.
Paul, you couldn't say it any clearer than that. Thank you so much for joining us today and for laying out such a genuinely clear vision for the industry that is industry informed. So we'll certainly keep following this as closely. You know, yes, we're over the first 100 days of government, but we also know that the first year of this government will essentially tell us what our delivery is going to look like over the lifetime of this government. So we'll be watching closely. The policy document I mentioned there, it is very important reading, so I encourage the industry to head over to the CIF website and download that. But for now, that's it from us here in Construction House today. My thanks as always to producer Katie Tallon. You can catch up on all of the Breaking Ground series on iPropertyRadio.com, and thank you for joining.